Welcome to your odor hygiene lesson. After going through this lesson, you'll be able to describe appropriate odor hygiene and containment best practices and know how to build a hide and clean up after yourself to reduce any risk of residual odor. Let's talk a little bit about best practices for odor hygiene before we jump into details. So, always store your hot and cold kits separately, not only just in different containers, but I like to actually store them in different rooms. Those essential oils are very volatile, they seem to get on everything in the air, so make sure that you're really careful about keeping them in separate places. They should also be somewhat temperature controlled, so you don't want them in very hot or very freezing conditions. Room temperature in a basement, a closet, something like that, a heated garage would be perfectly fine. Remember to always wear gloves when handling your odor or setting hides. And then try to keep your hides contained as you walk through the search area. So, something that people don't really think about when they're setting their hides is that they'll take one of their hides in a vessel and they'll walk through the search area, sort of deciding where they want to put that hide. But as you're doing that, you're spreading target odor in the air as you walk around. So, this is going to leave some lingering odor in your search area. So, be very thoughtful about taking your airtight containers into the search area and opening them only when you get to the place where you're going to be putting your hides. And then finally, always wipe down where your hides were placed with isopropyl alcohol. You want to try and let these also air out if you're reusing the space. So I might use a different space if I'm training at home after I've removed my hides and cleaned up a little bit. Or easier for a lot of people is just to make sure that you put hides on something that's removable. So you would then take the hide off the item, like a chair or like a TV stand or something like that, or a TV tray, I should say, like something that folds up that you can take out. You're going to wipe it up with your alcohol wipes, and then maybe you'll just take it out of the room if you want to reuse that space for another search in the same session. So that's typically how I manage my search areas as much as possible, whether that's at the facility, at home, or when I'm out in public if we've rented a space to train. Residual oil can honestly seem like sores to our dogs, so really try to keep your areas clean. It's super unfair to our dogs to have to try and work through really strong residual odor in the environment, especially our green dogs. This can be super damaging to their confidence and motivation. In this next video, let's have a look at going through a cold kit, and then we'll get into a little bit of storage and best practices specifically around our cold kits. Okay, let's have a look at what a cold kit would look like. We'll just unpack everything here together and I'll just show you guys what I have. You're going to decide for yourself what things are relevant for your kit and what things are not, and what you need and what you don't want. I do a lot of judging and teaching classes, so for me to have something in my kit maybe isn't going to be relevant for you guys, but a lot of times I'm going to need that for setting hides, for classes or judging or whatever the case may be. So first things first, I always make sure that my cold kit is well contained and stored away from my hot kit. So this kit seals fairly nicely. It's not exactly airtight, but it's got a nice seal on it. It has a little handle that I can carry it with. And then when I store this, it's stored well away from my hot kit, which is in a completely different area and a different room of the house. Or if it's here at the facility, it's in a storage room in the back, and we don't put any odor around that kit. So for inside this kit, I have kind of a few different things which I'll try to explain as I go along. I have all of my vessels in this little container. So that will look like, these little plastic containers, little screw. There's these little tiny vessels that I have. I have a bunch of these tins, which are pretty standard stuff you're gonna have in your kits. Everything's all magnetic together, so these little slide tins, so things like that. So basically anything that's never touched odor that's still new is going to be inside this kit. So these are all brand new vessels. I have tape, so this is less for setting hides and more for just marking if I'm judging or teaching classes, if there's been odor in a certain area. Of course I wipe that down, but still I have some tape here if I want to mark an area. I have some poop bags, you never know when you're going to need those, but also it's nice for when you're training in an area outside of your own training facility or your home, where you can just typically grab your hides, and often I'll just throw whatever I've prepared into the garbage and throw them into a poop bag and then toss them in the garbage before I leave. I have a couple permanent black markers markers for marking things. I have clean tweezers. I like some that have different types of ends on them. So this is a very fine end on this tweezer. It's helpful to kind of push things into little spaces if you need. But I have a couple of clean sets of those. Some Scotch tape, so this is really helpful for setting your hides if you don't have a magnetic area, so I'll typically use that. Or painter's tape also works really great for that. I already have a bunch of Q-tips cut up and ready to go, so those are just the cotton Q-tips, and that would be what I would put odor on. Some shrink tubes, and then I also have a whole thing of shrink tubes and straws already made up here, so you can see in the container there, a bunch of shrink tubes, more Q-tips, so I always seem to have a ton of those. A tape measure just for measuring my hide placement if I need it. A notepad for writing down where my hides are because I often forget. And then a bunch of pipettes. So I'm not sure if you can see that on the video very well, but I'll talk about when we start building hides, what we would want to use these pipettes for. And then in here I just have a variety of different things. So clean jars for putting stuff in. I have a tad. I have a screwdriver, so if I'm setting ground hides, it's nice to be able to push something into the ground and make a hole to put a hide in. I have of these 100% pure cotton makeup removal pads. These are really nice for also putting your odor on, so instead of using Q-tips, you could use something like this. This is really great. This is like, I think, like a craft sticker, but it's a double-sided sticky tape. So that's really great for setting hides sometimes as well. I like those. And then finally, I have some tin foil, and we'll have a look at why I use this when we're working on our hide building. So I think that's pretty much it for my cold kit. Like I said, you guys are going to decide for yourselves what you want to have in that cold kit, and probably it will grow with time and experience. So yeah, just kind of play around with it. Most importantly is just to make sure that you're keeping it separate from your hot container. And I typically keep this separate in an entirely different room. I don't store it together with my hot kit at all. Okay, let's have a look at what a cold kit would look like. All right, let's just have a look at some best practices for storing your cold kit. So as a reminder, your cold kit's for any items, accessories, or tools that you may use that do not come in contact with your target odor. We want to be super careful about handling and storage of this kit, as essential oils are easily transferred between items. Ensure your cold kit is never stored with your hot kit, not even in the same room if you can avoid it. My hot kit I keep at work in a closet, far, far away from the closet that stores all of my cold items. And those cold items will also include containers and things like that. If I've had containers or items that I've put odor in, those would be stored with my hot items. And then any tools that were used to set hides, so your tweezers, for example, make sure you wipe those all down with alcohol before putting them back into your kit. In this next video, we're going to talk about my hot kit and also a little bit of hide building terminology and best practices, and then we'll look at the steps a little bit closer. Look at how we would build a hide and how we would best store our odor so that we have no leaking, no residual odor, we're not contaminating anything else in our household. So first of all, always wear gloves when you're handling odor. This to me just seems like a no-brainer because we don't want to get odor all over our hands, all over our furniture, and then spreading it around all over our home. I always tell everyone that odor is a little bit like glitter. So you know when you go to the dollar store to buy a gift bag and you come home and there's glitter all over the front seat of your car even though you didn't buy a bag with glitter on it? That's a little bit how odor works, and so we want to make sure that we're being really, really careful and not getting odor, residual odor, which means odor left in the environment on a surface by odor being touched onto something. So that's the big thing that we want to be really careful about. When I start building my hides, I will often put down a piece of tin foil like this, especially if I'm at home or at a hotel and the surface isn't, it's going to be accessible to my dogs. I don't want to have my dogs coming to this table later and smelling oil that I dripped all over the place. So that's something that, I try to, do quite carefully. So I would put the tin foil down, then I would get, so these are my clean Q-tips, so I always start with a Q-tip or some sort of substrate, so you can use cotton pads, Q-tips, Wattman paper, it doesn't really matter. So I dump a couple of my Q-tips out, And I also am going to grab a few of my shrink tubes, so I'm going to put a few of those out because I always want to put my hides inside of a shrink tube of some sort. So even though I'm going to put these in a vessel later, my preference is to always put my Q-tips in a shrink tube. It's just less likely that we're going to have problems with contamination and residual oil and all that kind of stuff. I keep my oil bottles in a Mylar bag, so these are pretty airtight. And you know, for the most part, those plastic seams are going to deteriorate over time, so you're going to want to replace these. But that's typically what I use is the Mylar bags. And just for reference, I do keep kind of everything in like one big container, which I then snap a lid on afterwards. But all of my individual odors are stored separately. So this pine odor gets its own Mylar bag, and then it would stay in its own airtight case. So either a Pelican case or glass jars are really nice. They're super handy, cheap, easy to get. Like anything, these will also break down over time. So my Pelican cases are actually quite in need of replacing. If you can smell your odor when you take this out of your case, that's probably a pretty good indication that it's not airtight anymore. So you're gonna wanna get something that's more airtight. So something going like to a glass jar is probably what I'm gonna do so I don't have to spend all the money replacing my Pelican cases. So when I have my odor out, I have this here. What you can do is you can either use the dropper on the bottle if there is a dropper, or some other people will use a little pipette, which I don't happen to have handy right now, but I'll show you guys in the photos what that looks like later. But typically I'll just take my oil bottle and one of my Q-tips, and I'm going to just dab one drop of oil onto my Q-tip. And then I'm going to put that inside of a shrink tube, just like that. So now you just have this little shrink tube. And what I like to do with my prepared Q-tips inside their shrink tube is just have one little container. It's not vented, and this is just like a holding case for all of my odor. And I'm gonna put them inside of this container, and then that way I have something nice and easy to hold my odor with inside of my Pelican case. And before I put that in there, I'm going to want to wipe this down a little bit with some alcohol. If I can get that open. Reason being is that, you know, there could be a little bit of residual oil on the outside of those shrink tubes as well. So I just make sure that there isn't anything in there. I wipe everything out with an alcohol swipe, and then I put that inside the little container. So that's basically how to build a hide. I'll do a close-up video of this as well so you guys can see what that looks like a little closer up, but that's very simple and easy to do. Look at how we would build a hide and how we would best store our odors that we have. Some of my best practices for storing your hot kit are as follows. So remember that your hot kit is anything that has come in contact with your target odor. So this will include your oils, your vessels, all of those things will live inside this kit. Also, I have a whole area where I store all of my hot containers. So if I've put odor in a container, it gets marked as hot, usually on the inside of the lid somewhere. And then I'm going to be putting that in the storage area with all of my hot kit as well. Typically, I have like a big Rubbermaid bin with a lid on it that I can store all of those sort of accessories. Remember, you always want to wear gloves. You're going to contain each odor separately in their own airtight container. So if you have, 4 to 8 different types of target odors and they're all essential oils, you're going to definitely want to keep those all separately because they can really kind of cocktail together if you don't have them all in their own airtight container. So take your glass jar, your Mylar bags, your Pelican cases, whatever the case may be, and just really watch to replace those if your seals start to wear. So if you can smell odor, that's probably a pretty big indication that you need to replace that container. And then you're going to store all of those odor containers in an airtight container. You can definitely have them all together in one carrying case as long as the actual containers that each target odor is contained in are airtight. And then remember to store your hot kit well away from your dog and your cold kit. So a lot of times people say, oh, I put it in my hall closet. But, even as airtight as we think those kits are, I do believe that there's always a little bit of odor available to our dogs. And so I really don't tend to store that sort of stuff in my living area. So for me at home, I have kind of a storage room in the basement that the dogs never go around. And that's where I keep my cold kit there. So in this next video, let's just have a little bit of a close-up look on some hide building. All right, let's have a little close-up view on how I prepare a hide. So the droppers that come with these essential oil bottles are usually pretty inaccurate in terms of measuring out 1 drop of oil. So you can use instead these little pipettes. You can get them on Amazon, pretty much a lifetime supply, 10,000 of them in a bag for like 20 bucks. But this is what I would use to take my oil out. Obviously don't need that much, but I'm gonna take one of my Q-tips and I'm just gonna put 1 drop of oil on there. And then I'm gonna put this in a shrink tube. Put that in there, just like that. So you can't see on either end the Q-tip sticking out at all. So you want your shrink tubes to be just a little bit bigger than the actual Q-tip length itself. And then I'm gonna put that inside the container once I wipe it down with a little bit of alcohol wipe, just to make sure there's no residual oil on that. And then I'm gonna put it in the container. And then usually once I'm done with that, I'm gonna put it in my container where it's all enclosed. I'm gonna wipe it down, make sure there's no oil on it, and then I'm gonna put that inside my glass jar for storage. So just like that. And that's how I would store my oil. So very simple like that. You can also, I have my Pelican case here already set up with some hides, just so you guys can see what this looks like. But inside my Pelican case here, I have already some hides prepared. So I would say probably, a couple weeks, depending on how often you're using your hides. You should probably change them, every couple weeks. There's no real science about this or, best practices in terms of the essential oils. Nobody's paying money to study that, unfortunately. But in this one, I have a piece of paper towel, and a magnet. And then in the other one, I believe in the slide case, I have a shrink tube, I'm not sure if you can see that without it falling out, and a magnet. So those ones are nice and easy. You can stick them to surfaces that are obviously metal. And I also have some centrifuges with already a shrink tube inside there, and then one without. So that's kind of what my case looks like in here. And then normally I would put my prepared hides also in this little container just so that they're easy to access. I tend not to typically leave my hides inside the vessels because the oils can get really sticky and they're gonna spread all over your vessel. So as a kind of a best practice, it's better just to take them out when you're finished with them and put them back into the jar where you would store your prepared hides. All right, let's have a little close-up view on how. All right, let's look at the steps to build your hides. So as a starter, always make sure that you wear gloves. And as a side note, change your gloves for each new odor. So if you've created your wintergreen hides, then it's time to take off those gloves and potentially even change the tinfoil if you've gotten oil all over the place, and then just kind of set up a new station for your new odor. That way nothing's getting mixed by accident. Always know your trial organization's rules. So depending on the organization that you're trialing with, you may want to prepare your odor differently depending on kind of the organization and what their requirements are. So for a Sporting Detection Dog Association and the Canadian Kennel Club, which are the two organizations that I primarily trial with, they prepare the Q-tips with 1 drop of oil on a Q-tip. Other organizations, such as NACSW or CWAGs, they do more of a kind of like dropping a few drops of oil into the jar and then putting the Q-tips in there and sort of letting it all stew in there. So you need to kind of understand the rules of how the judges are supposed to be preparing their hides, because you're going to want to train on similar concentrations and prepare your hides similarly for the organizations that you're going to trial with. Try and use shrink tubes wherever possible over your Q-tips. Even though you're putting it in a vessel, I find that this reduces the residual oil risk at least by a little bit, and I think the extra step is worth it. Store your prepared hides in a tin or container for easy access. So typically within each one of those jars you see in the picture, I have one tin that is not vented that holds all of my prepared hides. So it's a Q-tip with a drop of oil on it, in a shrink tube, and then there might be 4 or 5 of those in the tin, and then that way I can just grab and go as I need them. People often ask how often we should be replacing our prepared hides. And the answer is it kind of depends. It kind of depends on how much you're using those hides. So, how frequently are they exposed to air? It depends whether your containment system is actually, in fact, airtight. And then it also depends on where you're putting those hides out in the environment. So, for example, if you put a tin on a diesel truck, for example, that could be very contaminated now. And if you're putting that back into your kit, the diesel and car residual odors are going to be on your hide, and that might contaminate your kit a little bit. So, if in doubt, when I'm picking up my hides and I don't know if something's been contaminated, I'll often just throw it out immediately. Not the vessel itself, but just the Q-tip and the shrink tube. But if it's really well contained and it looks clean when I pick it up and it wasn't in an environment where it should be getting like dirty or having any sort of contaminated odor on it, then every like couple 2-3 weeks is probably a good rule of thumb in terms of freshening up your hides. And so when I say freshening up your hides, I mean throwing out the prepared ones and making brand new ones from scratch. I do not ever take a Q-tip that already had odor on it and add more. So make sure that you wipe down all of your hides and your vessels with alcohol before putting them back into your kit. So the last thing we want is to have all of this good attention to odor hygiene and making sure that you're wearing your gloves and then finding out that your kit's getting contaminated because you're putting a Q-tip back in there, and it's going to be bouncing around and getting odor all over your tins. So I try to be really careful about wiping everything down before I put it back in there just to be safe. And then when you're all finished preparing your hides, you're going to take your used gloves, your tin foil, your alcohol wipes, and anything else you use to prepare your hides and take that to your outdoor garbage bin. So don't crumple this stuff up and throw it into your kitchen cabinet garbage bin, because your dogs will surely be able to smell that. So, in summary, please take odor hygiene very seriously for the sake of your dog and also for others potentially training in the area. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a public area and seen someone doing nose work with their dog. It's a very popular and growing sport, and so it's more and more likely that we're going to have people using similar areas. If it looks good to you for training, it probably looks good to other people for training. So, please try and do your best and make sure that you're not getting residual oil into your environment. Know the rules for the organization you're trialing with, and make sure that you're preparing your hides per the organization that you're going to trial with. If you trial with many different organizations, know those rules and train on that concentration of odor so that your dog understands what's expected and that it's not a new concept to them if they're seeing either a higher or lower amount of concentration. Ensure your storage is entirely separate for hot and cold items and your kits. So, like I said, have them in entirely different rooms if at all possible. Replace your hides frequently. Don't get them contaminated from the environment and then throw them back into your kit. And you can never have too many nitrile gloves and alcohol wipes. So make sure that you always have a good stock of these. It sucks running out of them. You pretty much can't do much if you don't have your nitrile gloves and your alcohol wipes. So make sure you always have a good supply of those in your kits.